Jessica Hale was the flight attendant. Everyone noticed, and Ethan Clarke was the married pilot who should have known better. What began as a secret affair at 30,000 feet would soon spiral into a deadly game of lies, smuggling, and disappearance that no one saw coming. Jessica Hale had always dreamed of flying, not just in planes, but above expectations, away from the routine of small-town life and into something larger, more glamorous. When she secured a job as a flight attendant with sky-high airlines, it felt like her ticket out. She wore her uniform with pride, charmed passengers with practiced grace, and learned the rhythm of jet-setting life quickly. Yet despite the shimmer on the surface, Jessica carried secrets, ones she had worked hard to bury. What no one knew was that Jessica never left chaos too far behind. In the same airline, Captain Ethan Clarke was something of a legend. He had flown for nearly 20 years and was known for his business, calm demeanor and magnetic presence in the cockpit. Tall, clean-cut and with a quiet confidence that made passengers feel safe, he was respected by his crew and trusted by the airline. But behind his polished professionalism was a man living two lives. At home, he had a picturesque life with Claire, his high school sweetheart, now wife of 14 years. They lived in a quiet neighborhood in Denver, far from the noise of runways and terminals. Yet Ethan hadn't been truly present in that life for some time. Their paths crossed for the first time on Flight 217 to San Francisco. Jessica was the lead flight attendant on the crew rotation, and Ethan, the captain. It started with simple exchanges, checklists, small talk, glances that lasted a second too long, but something passed between them, a current neither could ignore. Over the next several weeks, their schedules overlapped more often. Coincidence, perhaps, or something more orchestrated. The chemistry was undeniable, even dangerous, but neither of them pulled away. Jessica found herself drawn to Ethan's authority, the way he moved through the aircraft like it was an extension of himself. He was disciplined, confident, and most importantly, married. But that detail seemed to fade in the haze of long overnight layovers and quiet drinks at airport lounges. For Ethan, Jessica represented everything he thought he had missed: youth, freedom, and escape. She was magnetic, unpredictable, and she listened with interest, unlike the comfortable silence that had settled into his home life with Claire. Soon, rumors began to swirl among the crew. Nothing solid, just whispers in break rooms and behind lavatory doors. A knowing look here, a question asked with just enough curiosity to sting. But in an industry where discretion was valued as highly as punctuality, nothing was ever said directly. Jessica played it cool, dismissing suggestions with a smirk and a change of subject. Ethan, more cautious, avoided eye contact when others were around. Still, their connection deepened. Late one evening, during a layover in Chicago, something shifted. Jessica had a habit of staying behind after the flight, ensuring every last detail was perfect. But this time, she lingered longer than usual, alone in the galley, until Ethan came to check. No one saw what happened next. No one would talk about it, even if they had, but by the time they left the hotel the next morning, something unspoken had solidified between them. From that point on, it was no longer just flirtation, it was a full-blown affair. What neither of them knew was that someone else had started paying attention. A figure from the edges of the airport, unnoticed, but observant, had begun to track movements, times and habits. Flights were being logged, hotel check-ins recorded. A quiet mind behind curious eyes was piecing something together, and the more he saw, the more the story refused to stay simple. As Jessica and Ethan's affair ignited in secret, the world around them continued to turn. But cracks were forming beneath the surface, hidden in the routine of takeoffs and landings, and though the skies seemed calm for now, a storm was gathering, one that neither of them could see coming. The affair between Jessica Hale and Captain Ethan Clarke didn't start with declarations or promises. It was built in silence, quiet hotel lobbies at midnight, brushed hands passing flight manifests, and stolen glances from opposite ends of the galley. Each flight became a stage for a story no one else was meant to see. But something had changed. What had once been a flirtation grounded in secrecy was now a high-risk game, carried out 30,000 feet above the world, and each mile in the air only seemed to pull them deeper into something far more dangerous than either imagined. The secrecy was thrilling at first. They communicated through subtle gestures, a pen mark on a manifest, a folded napkin left behind, a quick message sent through private apps. Their schedules had begun aligning too frequently to be considered coincidence. Jessica, using her connections with the scheduling department, had learned how to manipulate rosters, subtly pairing herself on Ethan's flights under the radar. Ethan didn't ask questions. He welcomed the familiarity, but it was the kind of closeness that couldn't go unnoticed forever. Jessica began to take greater risks. On a flight to Dallas, she slipped into the cockpit under the pretense of delivering coffee, staying longer than necessary. Ethan's co-pilot, a younger first officer named Brent, didn't say anything, but his silence was too sharp to be mistaken for ignorance. Later, a photograph surfaced in a private employee group chat, grainy, taken from behind, but clear enough to spark questions. It showed Jessica leaning into the cockpit, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. No one said anything directly to them, but the tension among the crew began to shift. Conversations stopped when either of them entered the room. The air around them grew tight, heavy with quiet judgment. What made things worse was how bold Jessica was becoming outside of work. She started leaving clues intentionally or not. A text sent to the wrong person, a scarf left in Ethan's flight bag, a bill from a hotel bar, charged to Ethan's corporate card. Each mistake, however small, planted seeds of suspicion. Claire, Ethan's wife, found the bar receipt one evening. When unpacking his luggage, she stared at the unfamiliar signature scrawled at the bottom, the time stamp just past midnight, and knew without needing to ask. Still, she said nothing. She wasn't ready yet. She needed more than suspicions. She needed proof. As Jessica's obsession grew, so did her need to be acknowledged beyond the shadows. She began asking questions about Ethan's marriage, his routine, his plans for after. Ethan, unsure of what he truly wanted, danced around answers. He had told himself this was just a temporary escape, a fling, but Jessica didn't view it that way. To her, this was real, permanent, inevitable, and she was growing impatient with the limits secrecy imposed. But while Jessica and Ethan remained tangled in their own reckless emotions, someone else had moved from curiosity to concern. Mark Rivers, a veteran aircraft mechanic with an eye for detail, had started noticing small inconsistencies. Flight logs were being altered, maintenance forms were being signed off faster than protocol allowed, and then there were the odd pairings on flight assignments. Jessica and Ethan, together more often than seemed reasonable. Mark had seen enough workplace scandals to recognize when something was brewing, but this felt different. There was a pattern here, something that didn't just hint at personal misconduct, but professional compromise. He began keeping notes, nothing official, just observations, flight numbers, dates, timestamps, overlapping schedule. He didn't know what he was looking for yet, but something about the way the puzzle pieces aligned made his instincts flare. The tighter Jessica and Ethan clung to their secret, the more it seemed the walls around them were beginning to close in. Above the clouds, they moved as though untouchable. But back on the ground, unnoticed by them both, their affair was setting off a chain of events that would eventually reach its breaking point. And when it did, the damage wouldn't just be emotional, it would be criminal. Mark Rivers had worked in aviation maintenance for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't flashy or loud, but he saw everything. The kind of man who noticed details others overlooked, scratches on a landing gear panel, a slight delay in hydraulic pressure, a single bolt out of place. While most people focused on what was happening in the air, Mark kept his eyes on the ground. And lately, something wasn't adding up. It started with the paperwork. Routine post-flight inspections were being signed off too quickly, checklists marked complete before Mark even reached the aircraft. Normally, flight attendants weren't involved in those final checks, but Jessica Hale's name began popping up in time logs and maintenance notes, always hovering near the cockpit long after landing. Her presence wasn't protocol. She didn't belong there, but somehow, no one questioned it, except Mark. He remembered a specific flight from Atlanta to Seattle. The aircraft had arrived without incident, yet the pilot's maintenance log included a vague note about a sensitive equipment concern. There was no follow-up request, no diagnostics, and oddly, no real issue, just a cryptic remark. Mark flagged it and brought it to a supervisor, but it was brushed off. These things happened, he was told, pilots sometimes made vague notes just to cover themselves. Mark wasn't satisfied. That same aircraft flew out again within hours, and Jessica was seen reboarding it before takeoff, even though she wasn't on that crew. She claimed she left her phone on board, but the excuse felt rehearsed. Mark began to dig deeper. He pulled schedule records, cross-referenced crew assignments, and found the same two names, Ethan Clarke and Jessica Hale, linked together again and again. Too many times for coincidence. He wasn't the gossiping type, but the pattern was too strong to ignore. Something was happening, and it wasn't just a workplace romance. He'd seen those before. This was different. This was strategic. He kept his thoughts to himself, continuing his work as if nothing was wrong. But behind the scenes, he began keeping a private log: photos, timestamps, gate assignments, tail numbers. One night, while reviewing security footage from a maintenance bay where a sensor had failed, Mark noticed something unusual. Jessica, in uniform but off-duty, was captured, walking alone into a restricted maintenance corridor. Moments later Ethan appeared. The footage was low resolution, but there was no mistaking the urgency in their movements. It wasn't affection, it looked like a handoff, an exchange of something. A small black bag. Then they both disappeared from view. No report had been filed about unauthorized access. No one had flagged the footage, but to Mark, it confirmed a growing suspicion. The affair wasn't just emotion, there was a purpose behind it, something hidden in plain sight, carefully cloaked in the rhythms of airline operations. He began researching Ethan more thoroughly, a decorated pilot, clean record, respected by the industry, but even perfect reputations can hide ugly truth. Financial records weren't available, but Mark found a trail of unusual travel upgrades, charged to Ethan's company account, luxury hotel suites, late check-ins, cancelled return flights that coincided with Jessica's downtime. Still, Mark had no proof of anything criminal, just puzzle pieces, and a gut feeling that whatever they were involved in, it was bigger than infidelity. He debated going to security or even law enforcement, but without concrete evidence, he'd be dismissed or worse, risk his own job. So he kept watching, waiting, tracking. Jessica and Ethan carried on, unaware of the eyes following their every move. To them, the danger was external: discovery by the airline, whispers among the crew, but the real threat was already much closer. Mark wasn't going to look away, not anymore. Something was coming, and he intended to be ready when it arrived. The flight from Denver to Miami was supposed to be routine: clear skies, light passenger load, and an experienced crew. Ethan Clarke was in the cockpit as usual, calm and composed, with his flight plan memorized and pre-flight checks completed to perfection. Jessica Hale was on board too, her uniform crisp, her smile practiced, but beneath the surface, tension was building, tight and invisible, like the pressure in a sealed cabin waiting to explode. Halfway through the flight, the aircraft experienced a sudden system malfunction. The cockpit lights flickered, warning alarms briefly sounded, and one of the navigation systems went offline without explanation. It lasted only moments before backup systems kicked in, but the crew knew immediately that something wasn't right. Ethan's voice remained steady as he coordinated with ground control, but internally, he was rattled. It wasn't turbulence or mechanical failure, it felt different. It felt planned. The incident triggered an internal investigation. Sky High Airlines had strict protocols for in-flight technical failures, especially those involving navigational systems. The maintenance team ran diagnostics on the aircraft upon landing, but found nothing conclusive. Everything tested normal. No damaged wires, no faulty component. It was as if the glitch had simply vanished. But Mark Rivers, who had been following the situation quietly, didn't believe in coincidence. He reviewed the plane's digital maintenance log, and noticed something odd. A software update had been initiated just 48 hours before the flight, logged under an outdated technician ID. The ID was valid, but the technician had retired months earlier. It was subtle, so subtle most wouldn't catch it, but Mark did. As he dug further, a pattern started to emerge. Minor anomalies had been occurring on specific flights over the past 2 months, always subtle, always fixable, always on aircraft piloted by Ethan Clarke. And in nearly every case, Jessica Hale had been part of the cabin crew. No alarms were triggered, because nothing catastrophic had happened yet. But Mark had seen enough. He knew these were tests, dry runs for something bigger. Meanwhile, Ethan and Jessica's relationship had begun to shift. What once felt thrilling was now burdened by paranoia. They were no longer just hiding from nosy coworkers or an unsuspecting wife. There was a new kind of fear creeping in. The near miss in the sky had shaken Ethan more than he let on. It wasn't just a glitch, it was a mess, and deep down he suspected who it was from. Clarke had been silent, playing the role of the supportive wife, but behind that quiet exterior, she was digging. The hotel receipt was only the beginning. She had begun tracking Ethan's movements, reviewing bank statements, comparing flight schedules, and when the inconsistencies grew too loud to ignore, she hired a private investigator. Claire didn't need gossip, she needed facts. She was done with guessing game. The investigator, a former federal agent named Rachel Voss, moved quickly. Within days she had gathered enough information to confirm the affair. But what caught her attention wasn't the adultery, it was the pattern behind it. Jessica Hale wasn't just involved with a married pilot, she was methodical, deliberate, and had connections outside the airline industry. Voss dug deeper, and found a web of encrypted financial transactions, tied to offshore accounts. Accounts linked, not to Ethan, but to Jessica. Money was moving quietly, and efficient, and it wasn't coming from her paycheck. The picture was starting to form, though the edges remained blurred. A forbidden affair, a string of system malfunctions, untraceable money, and now a growing sense that Jessica Hale wasn't just someone with poor judgment, she was a catalyst. Whether Ethan knew the full extent of what he was involved in was still unclear, but one thing was certain, whatever Jessica had planned, it was far from over. As the sun set behind the Miami skyline, and another flight landed safely on the tarmac, no one could see the fault lines forming beneath the glossy surface of sky-high airlines, but they were there, and the first crash, emotional, mechanical, and potentially criminal, had already begun. Jessica Hale had always been good at creating illusions, from her early days in flight school to her role as a seemingly polished professional at sky-high airlines. She had mastered the art of reinvention. To most she was just a charming flight attendant, with a magnetic presence and a bright future, but her past told a different story, one carefully hidden, now starting to unravel at the edges. Mark Rivers continued his quiet investigation with increasing urgency. The more he uncovered, the darker Jessica's history became. She wasn't new to manipulation. In fact, she had a pattern: brief jobs in high-security environments, sudden resignations, and connections to individuals who were later implicated in fraud, theft, and in one case, a smuggling ring, at a private charter airline. None of it had ever stuck to her, and there were no formal charges. Jessica had always been careful to stay one step removed, never leaving enough evidence behind to implicate herself. Until now, Mark wasn't the only one getting close to the truth. Rachel Voss, the private investigator hired by Clarke, had begun to follow the money. Jessica's lifestyle far exceeded what her salary should have allowed. Designer bags, five-star hotel stays, and unexplained international wire transfers painted a picture of someone living a double life. Through digital trails and discreet interviews, Rachel traced Jessica's financial activity to a shell company registered in Belize. That company had ties to a logistics firm known to be under federal investigation for trafficking illegal materials through commercial airlines, specifically through unmonitored cargo compartments on domestic flights. The implications were staggering. Jessica wasn't just sleeping with Ethan, she was using him, using his flight access, his authority, and his blind trust, to move something far more dangerous than love letters and secrets. Ethan had unknowingly become part of a larger scheme, one he could no longer claim ignorance to. Jessica's role had evolved over time. What began as an inside job, likely coordinated through external handlers, had turned personal when she targeted Ethan. Perhaps at first it was strategic, a way to manipulate a pilot with clearance and influence. But now, things had grown complicated. Jessica had developed real feeling, and that made her dangerous, not because she loved him, but because love was never part of the plan. Her emotions were a liability to the people she worked for, and liabilities, in her world, were eliminated. Meanwhile, Ethan was beginning to sense the walls closing in. He had started noticing inconsistencies in Jessica's stories, her unexplained absences, the phone calls she'd take, in hushed tones behind closed doors, the guarded expression that crept in whenever he asked simple questions. He didn't want to believe it, but doubt had taken root. It was growing, like a slow poison. One evening, after a tense layover in New York, Ethan accessed the aircraft maintenance logs, using a personal tablet he'd taken home. There, buried in archived notes, he found something that jolted him, a flight manifest from 2 weeks prior that listed unregistered cargo loaded during a late-night departure. Jessica had been on that flight, so had he. The cargo had never been declared, and wasn't on the official airline report. His hands began to shake, now trapped between guilt, fear, and a gnawing realization that he'd become an unwitting pawn. Ethan knew he had to make a choice: go to the authorities, and confess everything, risking his career, his marriage, and possibly his life. Or stay silent, and hope the truth stayed buried. But the truth had already started leaking, piece by piece. Mark, Rachel, Claire, they were all circling the same target. Jessica's mask was slipping, and the more she tried to maintain control, the more dangerous she became. No longer just an affair, their entanglement had become a gateway into something far bigger, far darker. What lay ahead wasn't just scandal or heartbreak, it was a reckoning, and everyone involved was running out of time. Jessica Hale disappeared on a rainy Thursday evening without a single warning. No goodbye texts, no resignation, no forwarding address. One moment she was preparing for a flight from Chicago to Houston, and the next, she simply vanished. Her uniform was found in her hotel room closet, neatly folded beside a half-packed suitcase. Her phone, wiped clean, was left on the nightstand. There were no signs of struggle, no clues left behind, only a cold vacancy that sent shockwaves through everyone connected to her. Ethan Clarke was the first to panic. He had been growing increasingly suspicious of Jessica's behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. Missed calls, cryptic answers, and moments where her attention drifted as if she were somewhere else entirely. He'd even begun to consider ending the affair, not just for his marriage's sake, but because of the growing weight of everything he had uncovered. But her sudden absence hit him like a storm. Not because he missed her, though he did, but because it confirmed a fear he had tried hard to suppress. Jessica had been hiding far more than an affair. Mark Rivers, meanwhile, saw the disappearance as something more calculated. He had spent weeks building a web of evidence, quietly tracking flight logs, inconsistencies in cargo documentation, and the irregular pairing of Jessica and Ethan on key routes. Jessica's vanishing act was not an escape, it was an erasure. Mark had seen it before, when low-level players in criminal operations were removed the moment they became liabilities. Either she had run to avoid exposure, or someone had made her disappear to protect a bigger secret. Rachel Voss had been closing through encrypted data trails, and the Shell Corporation in Belize. She had traced connections back to a ring suspected of using commercial airlines to move illegal technology components. Hardware that couldn't be shipped through normal means. The pilots, it turned out, were rarely aware, but with the right person on the inside, someone like Jessica, the operation had run quietly for nearly a year. And now, just as Rachel was preparing to go to federal authorities with her findings, Jessica was gone. Claire Clarke watched it all unfold with an eerie stillness. At first, Jessica's disappearance filled her with quiet satisfaction. The woman who had destroyed her marriage was no longer around to wreak havoc. But satisfaction soon turned to dread as she realized the implications. This was not just infidelity, it was criminal, maybe even deadly. And her husband was deeply entangled. She confronted Ethan with the evidence Rachel had uncovered: the flight manifests, the hotel receipts, the undocumented cargo. There was no more denying it. Ethan broke down. He confessed everything, or at least, everything he thought he knew. He admitted to the affair, the secrets, the moments he looked the other way when Jessica asked too many questions, or accessed things she shouldn't have. But what he didn't know, or pretended not to, was just how deep it went. He swore he never took money, never knowingly helped her smuggle anything. Still, his name was on the flight records, his access used. That made him complicit. Claire, still processing the betrayal, realized something else. Jessica hadn't acted alone. Someone inside the airline had helped orchestrate it all. Jessica was smart, but not enough to infiltrate cargo systems, modify flight assignments, and override maintenance protocols by herself. There was another player, possibly more than one, and they were still out there. As the rain soaked the city, and the news of Jessica's disappearance began to ripple quietly through airline circles, one thing became clear: this wasn't over. Jessica was either on the run, or buried beneath the consequences of what she knew. But whatever the truth was, it had only begun to surface. The crime had moved from secret hotel rooms and quiet flights into something far more dangerous: a widening investigation with lives, reputations, and justice hanging in the balance. The abandoned hangar sat on the outskirts of a rural airstrip in southern Illinois, long forgotten by most who once used it. Rusted corrugated steel walls, broken lights, and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete gave it the look of a place that had been discarded by time. But inside, it told a different story. It was here that investigators made the discovery that shifted the entire trajectory of the case. It started with a tip. Rachel Voss had been combing through Jessica's digital footprint and intercepted a communication from a burner number used just days before she disappeared. It was brief, coordinates and a timestamp, nothing else. The location led to the hangar. At first glance there was nothing to see, but behind a stack of rusted maintenance crates was a locked steel cabinet, recently installed, too new to belong in the decaying structure. It had no label, no identification marks. When the authorities forced it open, what they found changed everything. Inside was evidence of a violent struggle, bloodstains on a tarp, long blonde strands of hair and a flight crew ID tag belonging to Jessica Hale snapped in half. Scattered beside it were discarded gloves, an airline maintenance logbook altered with forged signatures, and a bag containing unmarked electronic devices, illegal tech components worth hundreds of thousands on the black market. Suddenly, Jessica's disappearance was no longer a matter of speculation. She had either been taken against her will or had staged something that spiraled out of her control. News of the discovery reached Ethan Clarke while he was grounded by Sky High Airlines pending investigation. He watched the footage of the crime scene leak onto a private aviation forum, unable to breathe. The broken ID tag, the blood, it confirmed what he had feared but dared not speak aloud. Jessica was in real danger, and whatever she had gotten involved with, it had swallowed her whole. Mark Rivers had been quietly assisting Rachel with technical knowledge, helping to decode the maintenance logs and trace the origins of the stolen components. The logs found in the hangar matched several of Ethan's recent flights, records Mark knew he hadn't signed off on. Someone had been forging entries using his technician credentials. He realized he too had been pulled into the scheme without knowing it. His identity had been compromised. Whoever had planned this operation knew how to exploit systems from the inside, and they were willing to erase anyone who got too close. But the real shock came when Rachel uncovered the final piece. One of the flight logs had been altered using a terminal at Sky High's internal operations center. Only 4 people had access to that system. Ethan wasn't one of them. Jessica was, and so was a senior flight dispatcher named Victor Gaines, an overlooked figure in the story until now. Quiet, efficient, and invisible to most, Victor had access to scheduling software, manifest overrides and back-end systems. Rachel began digging into his records and found multiple communications between him and offshore shell companies, dating back over a year. He had been orchestrating the logistics all along. Jessica was just the delivery mechanism. Victor, sensing the net closing in, disappeared the day after the hangar was raided, gone without a trace, leaving behind an empty apartment and a wiped laptop. With both Jessica and Victor now vanished, the case shifted from an internal airline scandal to a full-blown federal investigation. The FBI took over, sealing off records, interviewing employees and placing Sky High under scrutiny. For Claire Clarke, the nightmare had deepened. Her husband's betrayal had been painful, but this was something else entirely. She had been drawn into a criminal conspiracy, unknowingly living beside a man who had flown planes loaded with illicit cargo, unaware of the storm unraveling beneath their feet. Everyone involved now stood on a precipice. Jessica might be dead, or hiding. Victor was gone, Ethan was a disgraced pilot, and Mark and Rachel had uncovered only a fraction of what lay beneath the surface. But one thing was now certain: the crime scene wasn't in the hangar. It was the airline itself, and the worst was yet to come. The final descent began not with a siren but with silence. Weeks passed after the discovery at the hangar, and the airline industry moved on as it always does. Delays, departures, announcements echoing through terminal. But behind the glossy facade of Sky High Airlines, pressure was mounting. Federal agents were now embedded within the company. Internal audits were underway, and those who once whispered rumors about Jessica Hale and Ethan Clarke now spoke in hushed tones of conspiracy, crime and corruption. Ethan found himself cornered, stripped of his pilot's license, suspended without pay, and publicly humiliated, he had nowhere left to turn. The airline's legal team had distanced themselves, and Claire had moved out of their home, taking with her not just their shared memories but the last threads of normalcy he had left. He was alone, and the silence was unbearable. It was in that silence that Ethan made his decision. He contacted Rachel Voss and offered full cooperation, not just about Jessica, but about everything. The codes she used, the people she mentioned in passing, the maintenance reports that didn't add up, and the night she handed him a sealed package with no explanation, insisting it be delivered to the cockpit locker. He had buried that memory for weeks, convincing himself it was harmless, but now he knew it wasn't. Rachel relayed Ethan's testimony to federal investigators, and it proved to be the turning point. Cross-referencing Ethan's statements with airport security footage, baggage logs, and encrypted communication records led them to a breakthrough. Jessica had not vanished into the ether. She had tried to run. Her final appearance had been at a small private airfield near Albuquerque, where she boarded a twin-prop charter under an alias. The pilot was later found abandoned in a rest stop parking lot, tied up but alive. Jessica had hijacked the plane. Tracking the flight path was nearly impossible. She had disabled transponders mid-air, but forensic analysis revealed she had landed somewhere near the Mexican border. That was where her trail went cold again. But this time, authorities believed she was alive and in hiding, likely protected by the same network she once worked for. She had become a ghost by design. Victor Gaines, however, was not as elusive. His disappearance had left a trail, a private crypto wallet used to pay off co-conspirators, and an offshore account traced to a remote location in Panama. U.S. Marshals coordinated with international authorities and raided a property nestled deep in the jungle. There they found Victor disoriented, paranoid, and in possession of hundreds of documents that tied him directly to the smuggling ring. He was arrested without resistance. With Victor in custody, and Ethan's confession on record, federal prosecutors began assembling the case. Jessica was now a fugitive, facing charges ranging from conspiracy to commit fraud to international smuggling. Ethan was granted limited immunity in exchange for his cooperation but would never fly again. Mark Rivers was cleared of suspicion and hailed internally as the quiet whistleblower who had helped unravel the mystery. He declined recognition, choosing instead to return to his work, quiet and vigilant as ever. Claire, despite the damage, found a strange sense of closure. Her life had been turned upside down, but she had survived it. In time she testified as a witness in the federal case, her calm, steady voice providing a striking contrast to the chaos Jessica had left behind. Sky High Airlines faced a storm of lawsuits and regulatory penalties but avoided collapse by overhauling its internal systems and security protocols. The scandal had exposed more than just a crime. It had laid bare the vulnerabilities of a system built on trust and routine. In the end, the affair that began high above the clouds had turned into a web of lies, greed, and betrayal stretching across borders and lives. The skies were quiet again, but for those involved, the echoes of what happened would never fully fade.